In the heart of Angola, where ochre sands whisper secrets to ancient baobab trees, a legend once walked. Not merely a queen, she was a whirlwind sculpted from defiance, her eyes smoldering with the embers of 1,000 battles. This is the saga of Nzingam Bande, a warrior who wove rebellion into tapestry with threads of cunning, forged alliances from the fire of adversity, and carved her name onto the bedrock of history with the tip of her razor-sharp blade. Imagine a land bled dry by the insatiable maw of colonialism, its riches plundered, its people shackled. Yet, from this crucible of despair rose Nzinga, a princess honed into a weapon. Trained in the art of war and diplomacy, her mind as sharp as the javelin she wielded, she refused to bend beneath the yoke of oppression. When betrayal snatched away her brother, the rightful king, Nzinga did not weep, she roared. Welcome to yet another interesting video segment. Today we are taking a dive at the life of the powerful Black Queen Nzinga and her great exploits in the Ndongo and Matamba kingdoms which she once ruled. Before we continue, don't forget to support our efforts by hitting that like button in front of you, share with your families and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening black narrative, and subscribe to help in building the rising membership of this channel. Every little support counts a great deal. Queen Nzingam Bande was an extremely important and defining figure in the history of the Kingdom of Ndongo, what is now modern-day Angola, in early 17th century Africa. She grew up in a period during which the Portuguese had felt their position in the transatlantic slave trade was being threatened by increased mercantile activity from British and French forces, and thus aimed to move their focus to the Congo Basin and what is now recognized as Namibia. The Portuguese involvement in the region affected the stability of the kingdom in a socio-economical, political and cultural manner. Portugal intended to turn Luanda, capital of modern-day Angola, into one of the largest slave trading ports on the continent by aiming to control the Kwanza River and to push Ndongo territory even further back so that they could supply Brazil with constant enslaved laborers to work on the plantations. Queen Nzinga's steadfast presence as an outstanding African leader at the time shaped the struggle against European interference in the region, unmistakably. Nzinga was born at some time in 1581 to Ngola Kiluanji. Ngola being a title for a ruler of the Kingdom of Ndongo, and Kangala, in a region that would now be known as Angola. According to legend at the time, Nzinga was given her name because she was born with her umbilical cord around her neck. The name comes from the Kimbundu verb kujinga, meaning to twist, turn. In addition to this, it was Ndongo's belief that being born in such a way signified that the baby would grow into a wise, powerful and proud individual. These were all traits that Nzinga proved to fulfill as she grew older. She had 2 sisters and a brother, but it is known that she was greatly favored by her father. He allowed her to accompany him while he carried out his duties as ruler of the kingdom, and he even allowed her to fight by his side while at war. This early exposure given to Nzinga was no doubt one of the contributors to her growing into a leader of admirable political and strategic acumen, as well as her being very intelligent and appreciative of various social circumstances. In 1617, Ngola Kiluanji died, and his son acceded to the throne as Ngola Mbandi. However, he lacked the insight and knowledge that both his father and his sister Nzinga possessed in abundance. Mbandi was inept as a leader. He had led the people of Ndongo into several wars against Portuguese forces, but his tactics led to widespread loss of life and territory. He was extremely jealous of his sister, and out of irrational fear of being overthrown by her and her followers, he engaged in a brutal political purge, eliminating many rival claimants, including his older half-brother and his family. Nzinga, who was 35 at the time, was spared, but her young son was killed, and she and her 2 sisters, Kambu and Fungi, were forcibly sterilized, ensuring they would never bear a potential rival. Some sources suggest that Nzinga was subjected to particularly harsh treatment due to a long-standing rivalry with her brother. Fearing for her life, Nzinga fled to the Kingdom of Matamba, an African state located in what is now the Baixa de Cassange region of Malanje province of modern-day Angola. After consolidating his power, Mbandi resolved to continue the war against the Portuguese. Despite forming an alliance with the Imbangala, his lack of military prowess led to significant Portuguese gains. In 1621, he sought Nzinga's assistance, requesting her to act as his emissary to the Portuguese in Luanda. Nzinga, fluent in Portuguese, agreed on the condition that she could negotiate on his behalf and be baptized. Arriving in Luanda with a large entourage, Nzinga sparked considerable interest, leading the Portuguese governor, João Correia de Sousa, to cover her party's expenses. While Ndongo leaders typically met the Portuguese in European clothing, Nzinga chose to wear traditional Ndongan attire, including feathers and jewels, to showcase the superiority of her culture. It is often said that Correia de Sousa approached his meeting with Nzinga with utter disdain and did not provide her with a chair to sit on, but rather offered her a floor mat, which, according to Mbundu custom, was only appropriate for subordinates. To have sat on the mat while the governor sat above her would have both set a hierarchical bias to the negotiation process and shown that she was unaffected by his insulting gesture. Nzinga took exception to this slight by the governor. Unwilling to accept this humiliation, she ordered one of her servants to get down on the ground on all fours while she then sat upon her back for the negotiations. Through this overt act, she asserted her status as an equal to the governor, not an inferior. This showed her powerful mindset, as well as the respect her followers had for her as their senior. According to the popular story, Nzinga skillfully used flattery as a diplomatic tool, contrasting her brother's aggressive approach. Upon concluding their meeting, Governor de Sousa noticed Nzinga's slave still in a crouched position, but Nzinga casually informed him that the woman was a gift, adding that the Ngola's envoy never needed to use the same chair twice, as she had an abundance of such. This scene was depicted by an eyewitness account, the Italian priest Giovanni Cavazzi, during one of his missions to Africa. Cavazzi's drawings are considered to be amongst the first sketches of African life by a European. Some of these drawings were made into prints and published in an extensive account of Cavazzi's travels. As an ambassador, Nzinga aimed to establish peace between the Ndongo and the Portuguese. She proposed an end to hostilities, permitted Portuguese slave traders in Ndongo, and offered to return escaped Portuguese slaves. In exchange, she insisted on the removal of Portuguese forts from Ndongo territory and refused to pay tribute, asserting that her people were not defeated. Nzinga suggested mutual support against common regional enemies. To demonstrate her commitment to peace, she underwent a public baptism in Luanda, adopting the name Dona Ana de Sousa, with de Sousa and his wife Ana da Silva as her godparents. A peace treaty was eventually signed. The two eventually came to an agreement, with the terms of the treaty heavily resting in Nzinga's favor. The Portuguese troops were to retreat, and Ndongo's sovereignty was to be recognized. This was a true testament to her insight and her wonderful skill as a tough negotiator. Nzinga returned to Cabasa in late 1622, marking a triumphant conclusion to her mission. Despite Nzinga's successful negotiations with the Portuguese, peace between Ndongo and the expanding Imbangala collapsed. The Ndongan royal family was ousted from their court in Cabasa, leading to the king's exile and the establishment of the Kasanje kingdom by some Imbangala. De Sousa was keen to uphold the treaty, but refused to assist Ndongo against the Imbangala until Cabasa was recaptured and Mbandi baptized. Mbandi retook Cabasa in 1623 and cautiously embraced Catholicism, but remained wary of the Portuguese. Nzinga, growing influential in the royal court, persuaded her brother to reject baptism, possibly to appease his traditionalist supporters. Meanwhile, the Portuguese began violating the treaty, refusing to vacate their fortresses in Ndongo and conducting raids for loot and slaves. By 1624, a deeply depressed King Mbandi had relinquished many of his duties to Nzinga, who was also named his successor. Mbandi eventually died under mysterious circumstances, with theories ranging from suicide to poisoning by Nzinga. Nzinga swiftly moved to secure her rule, seizing the monarchy's ritual objects with the help of her supporters and eliminating court opposition. She adopted the title of Ngola, gaining significant influence among her people, and arranged a lavish funeral for her brother, preserving some of his remains in a misete, a reliquary, for future consultation. A major threat to her rule was her 7-year-old nephew, under the guardianship of Kasa, an Imbangala war chief. To neutralize this potential rival, Nzinga proposed marriage to Kasa. Following their wedding, she had her nephew killed, which she viewed as retribution for her own son's murder. Nzinga's rise to the throne was met with strong resistance from male contenders from other noble families. As per Bande tradition, neither Nzinga nor her brother had a direct claim to the throne, as they were children of slave wives, not the first wife. Nzinga strategically countered this by asserting her rightful descent from the main royal line through her father. Unlike her rivals who lacked a bloodline connection, her adversaries used various precedents to challenge her, including her gender, which they argued made her ineligible. Furthermore, Nzinga's diplomatic approach towards the Portuguese, contrasting with previous rulers' combative stance, was perceived as weakness by some Ndongan nobility. Specifically, The treaty's provision allowing Portuguese missionaries into Ndongo was viewed unfavorably. As the succession crisis intensified, Ndongo's relationship with Portugal became increasingly complicated. Nzinga aimed to fulfill the 1621 treaty with the Portuguese to reclaim Ndongan lands lost during her brother's wars. Both Nzinga and Governor de Sousa, keen to avoid conflict, were eager to resume the vital regional slave trade. However, tensions escalated when de Sousa refused Nzinga's request for the return of Kijikos, a servile caste of slaves traditionally owned by Ndongan royalty, from Portuguese territory, as per the treaty. Instead, he demanded the return of escaped Portuguese slaves from Nzinga's army. De Sousa also insisted that Nzinga become a vassal of the Portuguese king and pay tribute, which she firmly rejected. Relations further deteriorated when de Sousa launched a campaign in late 1624 to coerce Ndongo Sobas into becoming Portuguese vassals. Traditionally, Sobas were vassals of the Ndongo ruler and provided valuable provisions, soldiers, and slaves to control Angola. By making the Sobas vassals of Portugal, the Portuguese undermined Nzinga's position as Queen of Ndongo. To weaken the Portuguese colonial administration, Nzinga dispatched messengers, Makunzis, to encourage Ndongo slaves to flee Portuguese plantations and join her kingdom, thereby depriving the colony of its income and manpower. When the Portuguese complained about the escapes, Nzinga replied that she would abide by her earlier treaty and return escaped slaves, but that her kingdom had none. Her actions were a success, and many Sobas joined forces with her, strengthening her position and causing the Portuguese to fear a Bande uprising was imminent. Ascending the throne in 1624, she became a storm unleashed. Nzinga, the lioness, as her people called her, outmaneuvered her enemies like a spider in a grand web. She forged alliances with rival kingdoms, playing the Portuguese and Dutch against each other like pawns on a blood-soaked chessboard. Her guerrilla tactics, swift and merciless, were legendary. During her reign, which almost spanned 4 decades, she staunchly defended her people against Portuguese occupation by making the most of her militaristic and strategic understanding to strengthen themselves. After the Dutch captured Luanda in 1641, Nzinga immediately sent them an embassy with the intention of getting their support to reclaim the land stolen from them by the Portuguese. After a series of battles during the period spanning 1644 to 1647, Queen Nzinga was triumphant in defeating the Portuguese and swiftly laid siege to their capital, Masangano. However, she was met with reinforced opposition a year later and withdrew to her previously conquered second kingdom Matamba, from which she continued fighting. She suffered a series of military defeats, most notably in a Portuguese ambush that saw half of her army, most of her officials, and her 2 sisters captured, though she herself was able to escape. By late 1628, Nzinga's army had been greatly reduced, down to around 200 soldiers according to one source, and she had been effectively expelled from her kingdom. Following her expulsion, Nzinga and her supporters continued to fight against the Portuguese. To bolster her forces, the Queen looked to make allies in the region while keeping her battered forces out of reach of the Portuguese army. During this time, she was contacted by Kasanje, a powerful Imbangala warlord who had established his own kingdom on the Kwanza River. Kasanje and the Imbangala were traditional enemies of Ndongo, and Kasanje himself had previously executed several of Nzinga's envoys. Kasanje offered Nzinga an alliance and military support, but in return demanded that she marry him and discard her lunga, a large bell used by Ndongan war captains as a symbol of their power. Nzinga accepted these terms, married Kasanje, and was inducted into Imbangala society. The exiled queen adapted quickly to the new culture, adopting many Imbangala religious rites. Nzinga was compelled to participate in the customary cannibalistic, the drinking of human blood in the kuya, or blood oath ceremony, and infanticidal, through the use of an oil made from a slain infant, the maji asamba, initiation rites required for a woman to become a leader in the highly militarized Imbangala society. The ritual was in part to prevent a succession crisis amongst the Imbangala in the future. She did not, however, completely abandon her Mbundan cultural roots, instead combining the beliefs of her people with those of her new Imbangalan allies. As noted by historian Linda Haywood, Nzinga's genius was to combine her Mbundu heritage with the Imbangalan's Central African military tradition and leadership structure, thus forming a new, highly capable army. To increase her numbers, she granted freedom to escaped slaves and land, new slaves, and titles to other exiled Ndongans. According to some sources, Nzinga, having been disenfranchised by the Mbundu-dominated nobility of Ndongo, was politically attracted to the Imbangalans, who placed more value on merit and religious fervor as opposed to lineage, kinship, and by extension, sex. Using her new power base, Nzinga remodeled her forces after the highly effective Imbangala warriors. By 1631, she had rebuilt her army and was waging a successful guerrilla war against the Portuguese, with one Jesuit priest, living in the Congo at the time, describing her as being akin to an Amazon queen and praising her leadership. Between 1631 and 1635, Nzinga invaded the neighboring kingdom of Matamba, capturing and deposing Queen Mwongo Matamba in 1631. Nzinga had the defeated queen branded but spared her life. Imbangala custom mandated she execute her, and took Mwongo's daughter into her service as one of her warriors. Having defeated the Matambans, Nzinga assumed the throne of Matamba and began settling the region with exiled Ndongans, hoping to use the kingdom as a base to wage her war to reclaim her homeland. Unlike her native Ndongo, Matamba had a cultural tradition of female leadership, giving Nzinga a more stable power base after she overthrew the previous queen. With Matamba under her control, Nzinga worked extensively to expand the slave trade in her new kingdom, using the profits from slave trading to finance her wars and divert trade income away from the Portuguese. Over the next decade, Nzinga continued to struggle against the Portuguese and their allies, with both sides attempting to limit each other's influence and take control over the slave trade. During this decade, Nzinga took on more masculine traits, adopting male titles and clothing. She established an all-female bodyguard for herself, and ordered that her male concubines wear women's clothing and address her as king. She also instituted communal sleeping quarters at her court and enforced strict chastity rules for her male counselors and female bodyguards. One legend records that Nzinga executed her lovers. She kept 50 to 60 men dressed as women, according to Dapa's description of Africa, as her harem, and she had them fight to the death for the privilege and duty of spending the night with her. In the morning, the winner was put to death. Nzinga was enigmatic and strangely powerful. According to an account by the Capuchin priest Cavazzi, Nzinga maintained her strength well into her later years. Upon witnessing her during a military review in 1662, the year prior to her death, Cavazzi praised her agility, to which the elder queen replied that, in her youth, she was able to wound any Imbangala warrior, and that she would have stood against 25 armed men, unless they had muskets. She was that strong. By the late 1630s, Nzinga had expanded her influence to the north and south of Matamba. Using her forces, she cut other rulers off from the Portuguese-controlled coast, capturing parts of the Congo River and bringing the region's key slave-supplying lands under her control. She also expanded her territory to the north, and in doing so established diplomatic relations with the Kingdom of the Congo and Dutch merchants who were increasingly active in the area. Nzinga also established a lucrative slave trade with the Dutch, who purchased as many as 13,000 slaves per year from Nzinga's kingdom. In 1641, forces from the Dutch West India Company, working in alliance with the Kingdom of Congo, seized Luanda, driving out the Portuguese and setting up the Directorate of Luango, Angola. The fall of Luanda was a major blow to the Portuguese, and Nzinga quickly dispatched an embassy to the Dutch-controlled city. Hoping to form an Afro-Dutch coalition against the Portuguese, Nzinga requested an immediate alliance and offered to open the slave trade to them. The Dutch accepted her offer of an alliance and sent their own ambassador and soldiers, some of whom brought their wives, to her court, soon assisting her in her fight against the Portuguese. The capture of Luanda also left Nzinga's kingdom as the preeminent, if temporary, slave trading power in the region, allowing for her to build a sizable war camp, Quilombo, of 80,000, a figure which included non-combatants members, including mercenaries, escaped slaves, allies, and her own soldiers. Using the large size of her army, her new wealth, and her famous reputation, Nzinga was able to reclaim large parts of Ndongo from 1641 to 1644. However, her expansionism caused alarm amongst other African kingdoms. In one infamous incident, she invaded the Wandu region of Congo, which had been in revolt against the Congolese king. Though these lands had never been part of Ndongo, Nzinga refused to withdraw and added the conquest to her kingdom, an act which greatly offended the Congolese king Garcia II. The Dutch, hoping to preserve their alliance with both Congo and Nzinga, brokered a peace, but relations between Nzinga and other regional leaders remained strained. By the mid-1640s, her successes had won her the support of many Ndongan nobles. With the nobility flocking to her side, Nzinga was able to collect more tribute in the form of slaves, which she in turn sold to the Dutch in exchange for firearms, thereby increasing her military and economic power. By 1644, she considered Garcia II of the Congo to be her only political equal in the region, while the Portuguese viewed her as their most potent adversary in Africa. For decades, Nzinga's reign cast a long shadow over the Portuguese ambitions. She outsmarted governors, outmaneuvered armies, and earned the grudging respect of even her fiercest enemies. Her legend, woven from tales of daring raids and cunning ploys, became a beacon of hope for a continent shackled by colonialism. After years of dogged battle and powerful resistance from the Kingdom of Ndongo, the Portuguese finally stood down, and King Pedro IV ratified a peace treaty with it on 24 November 1657 in Lisbon, which demanded that they renounce all claims to Ndongo land and to assist Nzinga's family to retain power in the kingdom. This perspicacity regarding protection of power was invaluable, because there were several failed attempts at a coup d'etat in her final years after the treaty had been signed, most of which were led by the Kasanje kingdom, and the extra help she was given was invaluable. However, she devoted her final years to rebuilding her community, which had been ravaged for years with war and infertile lands, and subsequently suffered with a depleted population. Nzinga aimed to rehabilitate former slaves and promoted the importance of childbirth in order to replenish what had been lost. Nzinga was more than just a warrior. She was a queen who nurtured her people, establishing the thriving kingdom of Matamba, a beacon of freedom in the encroaching darkness. She fostered trade, built fortresses, and championed her culture, refusing to let the embers of Angolan identity be extinguished. At the fulfilled age of 82, on the 17th of December, 1663, the lioness, Nzinga, finally rested. Although she died several centuries ago, she served as an inspiration to many women in anti-colonial movements which followed. Most notably were those who were instrumental parts of the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, MPLA, Movimento Popular de Libertação de Angola, which fought and achieved Angolan independence in 1975 after a 13-year war with the Portuguese army. Queen Nzinga is venerated in Angola today and is held as one of the most influential, powerful, and intelligent leaders in the history of the region. And her memory is celebrated with a statue in Luanda erected in 2002 to celebrate their 27th year of independence. Nzinga's story is not just about a queen who defied an empire. It's about the indomitable spirit that resides within us all. It's a testament to the power of resilience, of cunning, of unwavering belief in a cause greater than oneself. It's a story that whispers in the rustling leaves, echoes in the pounding drums, and burns bright in the eyes of every freedom fighter who has ever dared to raise a fist against the oppressor. Nzinga's story is not just about battles won and treaties signed. It's about a woman who defied the suffocating expectations of her time. In a world dominated by men, she carved her own path, becoming a symbol of female power and resilience. She was a queen who not only ruled, but redefined what it meant to lead. So the next time you hear the whisper of wind through the Angolan plains, remember the name Nzinga Bande. Remember the warrior queen who danced with death, outwitted empires, and left behind a legacy that continues to inspire us today. For in her story, we find not just the echoes of a bygone era, but the embers of a fire that still burns bright, waiting to be rekindled in the hearts of those who dare to dream of freedom. This brings us to the end of this video segment. Hope you learned a thing or two. Tell us what you think in the comment section below. We're eager to hear what your thoughts are. Also, don't forget to support our efforts by hitting that like button in front of you. Share with your families and friends to keep spreading our eye-opening narrative, and kindly subscribe to help in building the rising membership of this channel. Your support means a whole lot to us. Thank you for watching.